The Persnickety Witch of Fiddyment Creek by Gaye Pollinger. Chapter 1. The children scurried to find a spot on the floor mat as close to me as possible. They sat cross-legged with hands folded in their laps. A foggy mist slowly wrapped itself around the children. They weren't afraid of the mysteriousness. As they settled, I looked each child in the eye. I knew I had their attention, so I began telling the story. Good morning to you, boys and girls. My name is Miss Lucy, and I was just wondering, have you ever heard of the Persnickety Witch? I paused and looked at each child. She wears a funny straw hat and rides a faded red bicycle. Everyone has a story, even you. I directed my attention toward a wide-eyed boy. This morning, I'd like to tell you her story. She's quite a character and very charming if you get to know her. She notices every single thing, right down to the scabby scratch on your knee or the finest details of a flower petal growing alongside Fiddyment Creek, which bubbles and gurgles merrily on its way toward the river. That's what makes her persnickety. If you haven't seen her or don't know who she is, let me help you picture her in your mind's eye. Close your eyes so you can see her. Are your eyes closed? I'm not sure of her age, but she's quite tall and slender. She puts her long grayish-white hair up off her neck and secures it with the hairpins, but strands of it sometimes escape out under her straw hat. She wears a dress covered up by a bibbed and pocketed apron, and she wears an old pair of red PF flyers on her feet. She tucks some of the petals of lavender into a sachet and wears it with a ribbon around her neck. If you get close enough, you can smell the lavender. She has a gently wrinkled face, which appears to be soft. Wire-rimmed glasses that perch on the end of her nose are usually ready to fall off, and she has very sparkly, deep blue eyes. One has a teeny tiny spot with a glimmer of gold. When I was much younger, about the same age as you, I heard that she was picky, choosy, finicky, feisty, and fussy. Sometime, little children overheard adults call her the Persnickety Witch. Why? She didn't look anything at all like a witch. But I'm afraid that name stuck. Have you ever seen where she lives? Oh my goodness, each time I go past, I notice something new to admire. It's nothing at all like where you'd think a witch would live. There's absolutely whatsoever no sign of a cauldron, but there are lacy curtains at the windows, 2 creaking rocking chairs on the front porch, and wind chimes, both large and small, hanging from carved wooden figures or animals attached to cup hooks on the porch rafters. A huge asparagus fern and an enormous Boston fern spill in long waves over the sides of hanging baskets. The only thing witchy about her that I've noticed is Chester, her gorgeous black cat with huge green eyes. Chester likes to park himself on one of the rockers for a cat nap every so often he stretches lazily. She loves beautiful lavender bushes and colorful flowers. She grows all sorts of flowers in practically anything. An old boot, a copper teapot, a dented-in bucket, a wooden crate. Look around in your mind. You'll see. The sunflowers out back are especially tall this summer, almost as tall as the roof of the cottage. A flurry of deep purple morning glories encircle the railings of the 5 stairs climbing to the porch. A sweet-smelling peony bush, heavy with pinkish-white blossoms, complete with ants, scurrying from blossom to blossom, stand guard at the bottom of the wooden stairs. A smooth stone pathway meanders to the front, the side, and around the back of the cottage. A white picket fence surrounds the yard. Roses grow at the front of the house on either side of the picket gate in a kaleidoscope of colors. Their fragrance is almost overwhelming. Hummingbirds, bumblebees, and butterflies stay in the yard and dart from flower to flower. To the right of the house is a vegetable garden, and a big, beefy tomatoes are almost, but not quite ready to pick from the vine. So, there you have it. That describes the woman known as the Persnickety Witch. Thanks for coming. The children made groans and sounds of complaint. Oh, more? You want more? Are you ready for her story? Would you like to know about the Persnickety Witch of Fiddyment Creek? I paused and waited for the children to respond. They all bobbed their heads up and down, and some whispered yes, but they all sat quietly, so I continued with the story. Early each morning, the Persnickety Witch plopped a beaten-up old straw hat onto her gray hair, climbed onto her old faded red Schwinn bicycle, and rode past driveways of people out walking their dogs and dodged newspapers tossed on the sidewalk by the paper boy, occasionally slowing but never coming to his complete stop. One morning, she was in a hurry. Every so often, she pressed the lever of the bicycle's bell to let everyone know she was coming. A mason jar filled with something or other and a small bouquet of flowers from her garden bounced in the bike's basket attached to the handlebars. "Morning, Penel," said the old woman as she rolled past. Her voice trailed off as she pedaled along. "Morning," Penelope began, but she never could remember the old woman's name. And anyway, she was halfway into the next block. What is her name? Penelope wondered aloud as she looked up from pouring water from the big metal green watering can. The old woman was quite a sight with that old straw hat and her usual attire, and you could set your clock by her daily trips. Toddlers liked to stand by the gates of their yard and waving their chubby fingers at her. She would always grin real big and wave back. Children that age hadn't learned to be mean or cruel. It's interesting that nobody ever thought to follow her. I did, but that comes a little later in the story. I grew up here in Fiddyment and was raised by an aunt who arrived soon after my mother died, and my father took off to parts unknown. Now I am a mother with a daughter, Kathy, who's in the 3rd grade and loves to learn everything about people and the world, and Jameson, one of the toddlers who enjoys watching her ride past each morning. Fiddyment is a small town where you know everybody by name, and you don't have to lock your doors at night, and you walk in first for a visit with a high-pitched yoo-hoo, but without knocking. "Good morning," I yelled with a lilt to my voice as she approached. She raised her right arm in the air, flicked her wrist with fingers, and extended as her response. I'm sure I made a sourpuss face, but I saw that Penelope was still out, so I grabbed Jameson's short, stubby fingers, and we made our way over to the next yard. "Hey, Penelope, what is her story?" I said almost cantankerously as I nodded my head toward the diminishing figure on the bike, watching as it disappeared. "Bring Jamie over and we'll have coffee. The boys can play while we visit," Penelope replied. Penelope's dark eyes sparkled with the thought of sharing about the Persnickety Witch of Fiddyment Creek. I'm sure I bristled when Penelope referred to my son as Jamie. "Penelope, you know that his name is Jameson," I said, my voice low as I rounded the fence. Stuff like that really irritated me. I mean, after all, she had chided me when I called her Penny when we had been roommates at college. We sat in wicker rockers on the porch that encased the entire front of the mossy green Victorian home, sipped steamy hot coffee and dunked shortbread cookies into the dark brew while our boys, Jameson and Polly, played with toy fire engines on the immaculate lawn below us. Polly stood and came toward me and held up 3 chubby fingers. Polly, I 3-year-old," he said quite understandably. I smiled back and told him that he was a big boy. Hey, he said louder each time and pulled my skirt, trying to keep my attention. "Do you like alligators?" Then, quick as a flash, he was back to playing with Jameson. It was about then that Kathy came out of the front door and looked around. I spotted her and yelled, "Hey, Kathy, we're over here." She bounded down the porch stairs, and I watched her skip over looking oh so cute in her dreamsicle-colored shorts and matching halter top. We named her Kathleen after my mother, but she wanted to be called Kathy with a C and not a K. She was a spitting image of her father with fair skin, bright green eyes, framed by full lashes, and long, curly, copper-colored hair. She was full of energy from morning to night. She squatted and looked at fire trucks and then sat on the porch stairs pretending to be uninterested, but I knew that she was all ears. Penelope put down her cup and fidgeted with the flowery cotton napkins in her lap before she continued. The witch and her husband, they called him Will, but we've called her Persnickety Witch for so long I don't remember her real name, came to Fiddyment Creek a couple years after the Depression, and they built their house up on the hill above Fiddyment Creek, close to a weeping willow tree. He thought there was gold in the creek and panned for a while, but nobody ever said that he struck it rich. They tilled the soil and planted crops and a small garden next to the house. They had a cow or two and some chickens, and that's how they seemed to survive. Eventually, others came to Fiddyment, and Will opened a general store and in that wooden building a couple blocks down. It's been vacant a long time, but you can still make out the initials, W-O-W, up towards the roof. She nodded south. In the back corner of the store, he had a barber shop, which, as you know, is where all men gather, whether they need it to or not. Excuse me, Kathy, Jameson, Polly, would you like a cookie? Penelope glanced at me for my approval, and I nodded. She met them at the stairs to give them their treat. They squatted beside the trucks and munched away. Kathy counted the chocolate chips in her cookie and then nibbled on it, taking very small bites with one of her front teeth. Penelope continued. One spring, after a real bad long winter, the creek was already up to the top of the banks from the melting snow, flowing swiftly, and then there was a terrible thunderstorm. You know, the kind that makes you jump out of your skin and where you can hear the angels bowling in heaven and see gushes of lightning pierce through the sky. It must have rained nonstop for a week. The creek was beginning to spill over and flood the area. There was a cold wind blowing, the kind that could bite your skin, and it blew so hard it rained sideways. People didn't go out unless absolutely necessary. Willoughby insisted that he go to the store in case someone had a need. I could almost hear him speaking. "My dear, I just have this feeling. If someone needs something from the store, I must be there to help them." But she felt uneasy about him leaving. And after a moment embrace and a quick kiss on the cheek, he left. He trudged through the water and mud and opened the store's doors and sat on the slatted board sidewalk in front, watching and waiting. Finally, a couple of fellas came by, and they went inside and started a game of chess. Several others wandered in and watched. Then this wet stranger burst through the door and yelled, "Help! Help! My son has fallen into the creek and he got swept downstream. I couldn't reach him. I can't swim. He was holding onto a log, but..." You could hear the panic in his voice. I can hear it now. Jameson and Polly looked up, and both of us told them to finish playing. Everything was fine. Penelope was just telling a story. "That old store down there?" Kathy asked with wonder. She had recently lost a front tooth, and her tongue poked through the space where she talked. "Wow." Will grabbed at anything that they might need, a rope, a blanket, a pickaxe, a lantern, and a shovel, and off they went to follow the stranger. Two of the men went to get a rowboat. Will suggested that those remaining go further downstream to see if the boy had managed to get ashore, so that's what they did. As they hurried along, the distraught father told them that his son's name was Michael. They yelled his name repeatedly as they heaved weeds and reeds aside, glancing up and down Fiddyment Creek, now turned into a furious river. Soon the men with the rowboats came. Will got into the boat and with them, and they went farther downstream. He remarked to the men that he didn't recall ever seeing the water move so fast. It was so cold it made their teeth chatter, and it chilled their bones. It was murky from the muddy bottom stirring up. They pulled the boat onto the creek bank while tree debris and dead animals and huge sections of a red barn floated past them. The others arrived on foot, and the men stood huddled together and praying to Almighty God to help them. Then the unthinkable happened. A jagged bolt of lightning struck a tree across the creek, and there was a low rumble followed by a crack of thunder that sounded like a whip. Limbs and branches crashed to the ground and piled in a heap. Before they knew it, light rain began to fall and dampened their spirits even more. It was almost twilight. The sky was already darkened by pewter-colored rain-filled clouds when there was yet another splinter of lightning. This jag lit the sky a little longer. One of the men pointed to a form across the creek, huddled close to the tree that had been hit only a few minutes earlier. "Michael?" the worried father whispered. Now he yelled, "Michael, is that you?" Translite, he waded out into the speeding, furious creek trying to cross, and Will tried to stop him. "Wait!" yelled Will. "Let's take the boat across." But the man continued. He was chest high in water when he stumbled and disappeared below the angry creek. When he surfaced, gasping for breath, the swift current carried him away, and they could hear the terror in his voice as he yelled, "Save my boy! Save my boy!" Will was a strong swimmer, and he dove into the murkiness, stroked and kicked, trying to catch up to the man. The current was powerful. The other men stood helplessly watching. They could see a big log heaving in the current, aiming itself right for Will. They yelled to warn him, but their voices were lost in the storm and the wind. The stranger went under the water at exactly the same moment the log hit Will's head. Blood streamed all across his head and face and into his eyes and dripped into the water around him. Then Will lost consciousness and disappeared into the darkness of the raging Fiddyment Creek. "No!" the men all screamed all at once, as if with one voice. But it was too late. The remaining men managed to get the boy to the other side of the creek, and they searched for Will and the stranger until darkness and the storm stopped them. 2 men perished that rainy day in April. In the comfort of her dry home, Will's wife had been doing some mending when her head jolted, and she had this gnawing in the pit of her stomach. She and Will were so in tune with each other. She just knew something had happened, and she put on a dark blue cape and started half running, half walking towards town. She met the distressed bunch of storm-soaked men on the muddy road, but didn't recognize the boy limping from a gash on the bottom of his foot. They all started to speak at once, and she listened quietly, absorbing, processing, and watching the mud-covered and rain-soaked boy who had just endured a horrible tragedy. She didn't cry for herself that day. She would, just not now. Instead, she saved her strength for the boy and wrapped him in her cape and took him home with her to give him some hot vegetable soup and comfort. She noticed everything about him. He was tall and gangly, and he looked to be about 15 years old. When he was clean, he had thick brown wavy hair that needed to be cut, and his nose and cheeks were covered with freckles. His eyes were greenish brown, his neck long, and his front teeth overlapped slightly. After a day or two, he began to talk to her. His name was Michael Morgan. He liked to read, and he liked to whittle. He pulled from his pocket a whistle that he had carved in the shape of an owl. He talked about his father. He had no brothers or sisters. He never knew his mother. She had died during childbirth. And now he had no one. Will's wife told him that he could stay with her as long as he liked. "Might as well stay here, Michael. You don't have any place to go. And you'll be like my son, Will, and I..." Just as she finished saying that, there was a knock at the door. The itinerant pastor was there to tell them that the bodies of Will and Michael's father had been found. 3 days after the storm passed over and Fiddyment Creek's wrath ceased and the waters declined, the bodies of Will and the stranger were found floating face down, side by side, in a little cove about a mile from where they were last seen. The next day there was a funeral service for both of them. The whole community came out to pay their respects to Will's widow and to Michael, even though they didn't know him. They sat side by side on a wooden pew in the front of the little church. The men, who were strangers but now linked forever, were buried in pine boxes next to each other in the Fiddyment cemetery. Even before Willoughby died, the woman would go and sit under the weeping willow tree writing in her journal and sometimes play her dulcimer. Now that he was gone, she would grab his wreathed, weathered straw hat from the hook at the back door and plunk it on her head for her visit to the leafy mushroom-shaped tree. She spent long hours sitting there, staring out across the bubbling water. It was there she reminisced and cried and grieved. She had beautiful memories of her years with Willoughby, and she would move through this grief and live again. The townfolk of Fiddyment gave her about a week to mourn and then started knocking on the door and telling her that they needed supplies. Was she going to open the general store? She glanced toward Michael. He nodded one time. She said that she'd be there to open up within an hour. Word spread like wildfire, and by the time she and Michael got to the store, people were lined up on the raised wooden sidewalk. The women shoppers took their time browsing and looked for a new fabric that had come in just before the storm, and they offered their condolences. Several men gathered in the barber's corner and wondered out loud who would give them a shave and a haircut and trim their nose hairs. After a long day, the widow and Michael walked home, and in his thick southern accent he asked her, "Can you teach me how to cut men's hair?" So that night she cut his hair, and she told him what she was doing as he watched intently, and then he practiced with the straw on a broom. The next day the barber's corner, once again, was open for business. The women fussed over everything in the general store. She dusted shelves and rearranged canned goods and put things where they belonged, examined the huge pickle jar and the old Cracker Barrel, swept dust bunnies from the linoleum, and stood back and looked at everything to make sure it was lined up properly, and then straightened some more. Boldly, she ordered a few unusual things from the warehouses, and she gave the store a feminine touch. She even hung curtains on the window and put a vase of flowers next to the cash register. Now Jameson interrupted by calling out, "Mommy! Mommy, I want to go home! Mommy, can we go home?" As you could imagine, I had a million questions. I wanted to ask Penelope, but they would have to wait. Our boys had played nicely, but they were getting out of sorts, and they both needed naps. I think I should get Jameson home. This story about that Persnickety Witch is so interesting. Can we continue tomorrow? I asked tentatively. "Oh, sure," she answered. "The boys get along so well, so come over after she waves to them in the morning." Kathy walked silently, and I could hear her sniffing. And then she said, "Mama, is that a true story? Why did they have to die?" I explained to her that it was a true story about people of our town and that we all need to watch out for each other. After Jameson's nap, and him being very picky, almost persnickety about how I cut his PB&J sandwich, I put him in the wagon, and the three of us walked to town and stopped in front of the old general store. Kathy stood back on the edge of the sidewalk, looked up, and pointed to the fading initials, W-O-W. I stood on my tippy toes and peered through the dirty windows. It appeared to have everything: hardware, non-perishables, yard goods, fishing poles. There were still canned goods on the shelf, and some mason jars, and some figures of... What is that on the counter? A barber's chair over there, and oh my goodness, the chess set ready for a game. "Interesting place, isn't it?" the woman asked me. She leaned the bike against one of the walls and stood beside me looking into the window. Oh! She had startled me, and my hands flew to my face to hide my embarrassment. I felt guilty for even being there, but she had caught me. My heart raced as I tried to think of a good answer. "Well, yes, I was just curious about this old building." "I bet you are," the old woman spoke under her breath. "The general store belonged to my husband and me before he passed. It used to be a gathering place. It used to be quite but she stopped and stared into my eyes for an uncomfortable length of time. I held up my hand. My name is Lucy McGuire, and this is my daughter Kathy and my son Jameson. Children, say hello to this nice lady. With a C, Kathy said impishly as she gazed up to the wizened face. She took my hand in both of hers and looked me in the eye. Yes, I know who you are. I knew your mother years ago. You married Thomas, didn't you? She asked with an inquisitive look on her face. She turned her attention to Kathy for a moment. Hello, young lady with a C, letting her know that she'd heard. I think you must look like your papa. And then back to me. Lucy, it's good to speak to you again. You've become a fine woman. Your mama would be proud. She stopped for several moments before continuing. I'm Pearl. There was something in the way that she said her name. She cocked her head a little, and as if she were expecting me to recognize her. Pearl! At last I knew her name. I no longer had to call her Persnickety Witch, and I could tell Penelope tomorrow. She released my hand, waved to the kids, and climbed onto her bike and said, I'm off, and was gone. As she rode past, I noticed the bike basket. An empty mason jar was there, but nothing else. The smell of lavender hung in the air. The children, especially Jameson, had been so well behaved for this outing. I felt that a treat was in order, and so we stopped at Scooper Dooper for some ice cream. It was there I decided what to do. When we got home, I hurried to the kitchen. Hi, Becky, I said on the telephone. Would you be able to keep an eye on Kathy and Jameson tomorrow afternoon? Good. Yeah. And could I borrow your bike?